All right. Good morning or afternoon for some of you. My name is Allison Zvashka, and I'm the Merchant Services Administrator at Tufts University.
And I'm Ed Coe, Director of Information Security Services at CampusGuard.
And we wanted to share with you some of the ways that Tufts has overcome security challenges over the last few years.
All right, so here's the fun-filled, action-packed agenda for today's presentation. We'll start off with introductions, then go into a timeline of how we got here. We'll talk about what paths were chosen to get to compliance, the challenges faced, and what it takes to maintain compliance now that we're finally here. At the end, we'll open it up to you in the audience for any questions that you may have.
I'll start with just a little bit about myself. I've been in my role for 3 years, residing in the Treasury Operations Group of Central Finance with a close working relationship to the IT information security team. I mostly interact with departments who accept payment card as a method, but I also act as a liaison between our merchant bank and those departments. A little bit about Tufts. It's located in Boston, Massachusetts. There's roughly 12,000 students spread over 3 campuses. Now, of course, with COVID-19, not all 12,000 are in person this fall or this spring. We are doing a hybrid approach. But Tufts is known to be a leading research institution. In fact, in 2019, Forbes ranked it 25th among the top research institutions of the United States. But what I think is pretty interesting is our circus of mascots. So P.T. Barnum was one of the founding trustees of Tufts University back in 1852. Thus, we had Jumbo the elephant as our mascot. And then in 2016, we acquired the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, whose mascot dating back to 1937 was Bessie the Rhino. So when we did that, it's kind of ironic as P.T. Barnum's hopes and dreams for Tufts was to be kind of a museum of natural sciences, and now we have what I call the circus of mascots.
All right, and for those of you that I have not yet had the pleasure to meet, I'll give you a little bit of background about who I am. I have over 20 years' experience providing information security and compliance services within campus-based environments. Prior to CampusGuard, I was an information security and technology analyst at the Pennsylvania State University. As a co-founder of CampusGuard, I've personally conducted and delivered hundreds of assessments, which have helped me lead our highly qualified and deeply experienced team of security professionals. For those of you that do know me, you'll recognize the picture with the Treasury Institute background there. I believe that's from Austin in 2018, where I was giving a presentation about tabletop exercises, and not that kind of tabletop, but nonetheless, there it is for gags. As for CampusGuard, we're a cybersecurity and compliance company that specializes in organizations that have complex campus-based environments. CampusGuard performs compliance assessments, including on standards like this one, the PCI DSS, as well as GLBA, FERPA, HIPAA, and the like, as well as performing vulnerability scans, penetration tests, and provide ongoing support and training. For each of these services, you'll have a dedicated customer advocate team, which consists of an assigned customer relationship manager and a primary security advisor, all backed by a team of information security and compliance specialists. This team-based approach ensures that you have all the qualified and certified personnel to deliver the highest quality of customer care available in the market.
Like other institutions, Tufts has some history with data breaches. In 2005, the Ruffalo Cody donor database was breached, resulting in a roughly 106,000 donors and their personal information exposed or stolen. 5 years later, in 2010, the campus computers were exposed to a virus where 2,000 former student files with their social security numbers were also exposed. Then, only a year later, a researcher's laptop was stolen, which contained student application information, including social security numbers, in a spreadsheet. So, with this pattern, the leadership in my department, Todd Hibbard, the associate treasurer, and Donna Riley, the treasury operations manager, who were conference veterans, might I add, decided to take a proactive approach and say, we don't want the next breach to contain payment card information. So through the RFP process, CampusGuard was selected for its outstanding knowledge of the unique qualities, or obstacles, depending on how you look at things, that higher education presents?
So, as Allison pointed out, both Todd and Donna being conference veterans, I remember the conversation vividly. Unfortunately, I don't remember the year. It was either the last year that it was in Indy, 2013, or the following year at the Palmer House in Chicago. We spoke to Donna and Todd about some of these issues and what they needed to do. And we were able to come on site in 2015 after that RFP completed. And we performed a gap assessment at Tufts University. We interviewed all of the high volume and high risk merchant areas, as well as a representative sample of all of those other departments. Using that information, we were able to provide a gap assessment report along with a roadmap that documented all of the milestones and steps needed to get to full compliance. CampusGuard also participated as a member of the Tufts University PCI team and provided guidance, interpretation of the standards, participated in conference calls with vendors, and generally provided support where needed. Now, one of the most important steps that you need to take when you're starting a compliance journey is setting a strategic direction. And in Tufts' case, that really meant first getting and keeping those computers and networks out of PCI DSS scope. Initially, that meant keeping those dial-up terminals. And, well, for some areas where computers were a part of day-to-day life, we couldn't have them in scope, converting them to actually going backwards in technology to using analog phone line dial-up terminals. Hey, this was 2015. Sometimes there really wasn't all that great technology out there. The other thing we wanted to do, speaking about technology, was focus on things like implementing PCI-listed point-to-point encryption solutions, the gold standard in reducing scope and helping reducing burden. But where P2PE solutions weren't available, implementing end-to-end encrypted or E2EE solutions, again, to help reduce that compliance burden for IT. And in some of those areas, especially with E2EE, we looked at areas like dining using a Sequoia Retail Systems point of sale, not having at the time a point-to-point encryption solution available, and also things like CashNet, where an IDTech secure key was put into place versus any type of official P2PE solution. Then there were areas where it didn't make sense to implement P2PE, even if it was available, because it wasn't a complete solution. At least it wasn't at the time, or it wouldn't completely reduce the scope or do so in a meaningful way. And choices were made to wholly outsource those functions where possible. An example of this is the Ruffalo Noah Levitt's Campus Call program, knowing that just adding P2PE still doesn't solve the dreaded VoIP issue. And so they made this the call to outsource that to RNL completely under what the Ruffalo Noah Levitt calls the Masters program. And then ultimately, once all these fires were put out, using those lessons learned, taking advantage of synergies, trying to keep reconciliation processes simpler. There's a push now to replace the old analog terminals with point-to-point encrypted terminals, and there's more details coming up in a slide towards the end of this presentation.
So my role was created in 2017 as the finance leadership and PCI team that Ed was a part of identified that payment card method and acceptance was being widespread across campus, but the security really did warrant some dedicated time and attention. And so thus my role to the team. And so Ed mentioned that for 2 years, the PCI team did work on putting out those large fires, such as the Ruffalo Noah Levitt's Masters program outsourcing or different equipment to take computers off the network. But when I came in, there were still things that I thought were challenges keeping us from attesting compliance that weren't even listed on that roadmap just because of their fine peculiarities. One of those was a general lack of awareness of PCI. Not only were the regulations relatively new, but it was only a small set of folks on Tufts campus that knew what PCI was, how to deal with it, why it mattered, things of that nature. So it was not a widespread knowledge. In addition to that, record keeping within our own office was concerning in ways. We had some version control issues just because the records were being kept in different methods, whether that was on paper or in a spreadsheet, things of that nature. So that was kind of tough to know what the latest, greatest information was. In addition to that, the roles and responsibilities between the merchant departments and our PCI team, or even within our PCI team at different times, needed to be clearly established. And so those expectations with the departments needed to be set. Furthermore, we've all had this happen, I'm sure, but departments were working in silos and they were sourcing their own payment solutions prior to looping in the Treasury team or PCI team. And so after Todd and Donna retired in 2017, our relatively new Treasury staff decided it would be best to do a roadshow. And so we went out to various departments, looked at their business environment, and did a lot of fact finding. It was kind of a fact finding mission. This was one of the first and best ways I got to introduce myself and my role to these departments. Additionally, Treasury implemented a relational database to track our departments, the merchant account information, equipment, and contacts, kind of a one-stop shop for our PCI team so that we know what the current information is and we're able to track our progress. All right, after years of the PCI team working towards compliance, we finally submitted our attestation in January of 2018. And we all know that the difference between a meeting and a party is a cake. So while we did celebrate our attestation for the first time, and a lot of us did a nice exhale of relief, the thought kind of set in amongst all of us, our work is not done. Now we have to define what business as usual looks like for us. The reality is that when we think about the departments that we work with, they're front and center to their business role, whether that be in a dining hall or the athletic arena, maybe a medical clinic. They're the experts of that business operation, not the experts of PCI. That's where my team comes in. And so we wanted to build that relationship where they knew who to come to when they had questions and vice versa. So with some intentional communication, we were able to accomplish that. Some ways we did that was educating the department on what business as usual looks like, just using a simple graphic that you're seeing right now, where it shows a timeline, a task, and some high-level details within that task so that they knew what was expected of them, what was around the corner, and maybe why I was calling. In addition to that, I would schedule different meetings with them well after the Treasury staff did their roadshow. And again, I would schedule those intentionally at their location just to show that willingness to work together, as central finance sometimes struggles with that. But I learned through that who preferred phone calls over emails, who preferred in-person meetings, things of that nature. And so with that in mind, as I communicated with those departments, I tried to use a mixed media approach to get everyone involved. And while that was a helpful avenue before COVID, I needed to take some time to pause in March and think about how I could best help them in this uncharted time. I'm sure, like many of you, when we went remote in March, or at least for Tufts, that's when that happened, it felt like it happened overnight. And my inbox volume skyrocketed. Without having those in-person meetings, everything turned into an email. And it really hasn't slowed down since. And so I thought, if I'm receiving this many emails, so are the departments that I'm trying to email, right? And so I wanted my emails to stand out. And one way that idea morphed is turning it into a newsletter that I send once a month, going into, this month, I need you to know this. Maybe there's an update to a network or system that they need to know about, what's coming up next, roles and responsibilities, things of that nature. And so I find that extra time I've spent communicating with them or learning how to communicate with them has already been paying off, as I'm starting to receive those calls telling me, hey, our business model is changing. Is this okay? Or what do you suggest? So they're starting to know who to come to proactively, which is great. But our team knew that meeting them more than halfway was a deliberate choice, but one that we couldn't will our compliance into action, and we needed the department to participate in. Speaking of those groups that help us get the work done behind the scenes, whether that be the IT department, procurement, our finance group, maybe others for you guys. But to ensure those teams were communicating smoothly, we test our incident response plan during a tabletop exercise, and we found a few gaps and some places to improve. And everyone at that tabletop exercise on our PCI team is coming at it from a different angle, whether that be from finance or information security, and CampusGuard was there as well. So that really helped us hone in on those findings and the gap analysis to kind of put together a nice list of what we needed to address.
And what we find here when we do these IRP tabletop exercises that nod to my profile picture in my intro is that they're great ways to make sure that you're prepared to actually handle a real live incident. One of the things that we find to be most common when performing your first tabletop exercise is being able to know how or when to execute the plan. I call this ringing the bell or sounding the alarm, as most incident response plans assume that you already know you have an active incident going on. And then with that, also knowing how to appropriately and quickly alert those individuals that are identified in the plan so that things can be actioned.
So as we mentioned, we had a list of gaps or findings that we needed to address. And so we kind of took two different approaches in order to come up with our solutions. We did breakout groups just because putting together our entire PCI team and all of everyone's schedules is a task in and of itself. And so we did breakout groups so that the finding, if it was relative only to the folks in finance or only to information security, that they could get progress done before our next full PCI team meeting. One thing that I want to brag on our IT group to do is they came up with an intake form for our help desk. So when someone calls or initiates that incident response plan, the person on the other line is asking a standard set of questions, which gathers data from the very beginning, and it keeps it consistent, streamlining it. So that by the time our entire PCI team is alerted to it, we all have the same data and we have it from the beginning. Another method we used to get things done was micro meetings, which were just 15-minute calls scheduled 2 to 3 times a week, again, with pertinent individuals, not the entire team. But it kept us accountable, having that time dedicated on our calendar to give everyone a status update. Here's where I am with this. Here's the roadblock I run into. Can anybody suggest something else? Now, we have an ongoing effort to help educate our peers in procurement when they see contracts for vendors that accept payments. Obviously, Treasury is interested in all payments, whether that be ACH, wire, cash, check, but specifically payment cards for this scenario. We've provided them some education. We've given them kind of a hot list of keywords to look for, and it's coming together nicely. I have brought them thank you donuts to their staff meetings when they have kind of raised that flag to the PCI team when the contract comes across their desk. Now, if you had told me 3 years ago that I would be focused on creating a workflow for a new vendor and not necessarily worrying about what departments were out there, who was intaking credit card information, things of that nature, I would have smiled politely, thought you were crazy, and moved on. But we've been able to make some good progress in the past few years. And what I think was key to that is the relationship management of both the departments and the PCI team, but also the departments in the background, IT, procurement, finance, getting those functions together. That helped us switch from a reactive function to a proactive function as a PCI team. Like many of you, I'm sure we've been on our fair share of webinars talking about COVID-19 and the setbacks. And while I agree with that in most cases, I think this is kind of one of those scenarios where I look at it as an opportunity. Because for Tufts, COVID-19 expedited our someday list. It was kind enough to point out we had done very little preparation for emergency preparedness. We were not ready to go remote overnight, not accessing a building or an office, that paper file, so on and so forth. So it has helped us kind of put some measures in place for situations such as that. It also helped us do some technology upgrades, whether that was equipment or the departments that were relying on in-person payment, cash and check. They were moved to an online platform to accept payment cards. So we had different technology upgrades that had been on the to-do list, but with a low priority, they got moved up during this time. It also forced us to improve our documentation, whether that is local procedures or even things like this spring, I used a video recording software to create a training to simulate a shadow process that I would normally do in person when I deploy new equipment. So we've begun to really better our documentation.
And so critical to maintaining compliance is the ability to put all those new controls in place while rapid fire changes are occurring. Allison and the team at Tufts have done a fantastic job of pivoting, adapting, and keeping that documentation up to date. So we recently finished a remote assessment of Tufts following that timeline that Allison showed you a couple slides ago. And I can tell you that Tufts did a fantastic job, right? So year over year from that 2018 date to those annual visits and doing that status check of PCI, being able to keep those controls in check and do so even after the pandemic has thrown everyone into such a loop there, that those necessary adjustments and executing on those were key for maintaining that compliance. And aside from everybody struggles of a couple minor documented procedures and things of that nature, Tufts made it through largely unscathed.
Now, of course, our compliance work is never finished. Even we still have that to-do list. Some of those things include aged equipment. Ed mentioned that in 2015, we moved different business units to analog phone terminals. And some of them were slated to be upgraded to P2P solutions. And due to COVID-19, that timeline has shifted. So we still have some aged equipment we need to replace. I'm always looking for more consistency when I'm engaging with departments, whether that be in the terminology or kind of more proactive from their side, aside those tasks that I ask their help on. And then one of the big things that, because I sit in finance, I've identified as a challenge that I need to address is that timeline to adjust for the fiscal year end and the semester start, just because the volume and time spent by different folks doesn't always allow for that PCI project to be completed as I first outlined it. So I think that the relationship management of both the departments within IT, finance, information security groups are really critical to any security regulation, really, and keeping it a priority. Taking that time to learn how to communicate with those departments and ensuring that security is kept a priority through a multitude of ways is really important.
And those are great points, Allison. As with any relationship, communications are key. And keeping that open line of communication and being able to have honest dialogue with the departments and then including IT and finance can really help make sure that you're providing the right support and making sure things stay compliant. As we talked about that strategic direction slide where it was, reduce scope, use P2PE, outsource and all of that stuff, it's all too easy, in terms of getting compliant to say it's P2PE or nothing and throw your hands up in the air. But really, as you think about all of those niche markets that we serve and all of the varying ways that you handle credit card data and the customers that and their needs, there may not be a P2P option that's available, and creative solutions have to be created and dealt with so that you can still provide that outstanding customer service and customer care, but still also remain compliant and at the end of the day secure and prevent data breaches from occurring. So with that, we've reached the end of our prepared statements, and we open it up now to you, the audience, for questions. You do have the ability to unmute yourselves if you want to go that route, and we'll absolutely take any questions that are here in the chat as well. So we'll give the folks that want to unmute and ask a question first. Otherwise, there are a couple that have streamed in on the chat, and we can start there. All right, so let's go to the questions that are here in my chat window. Let's see here. Allison, what technology did you upgrade during this pandemic?
Sure. So kind of two schools of thought there. One technology was the terminals that different departments were using. Analog phone terminals, they aged out, and certain business groups, such as our vet school that's public facing, they never really slowed down during the pandemic. They may have been down for a few days to adjust some business model, but they needed their equipment to be reliable. And so we made sure and we deployed point-to-point encrypted terminals with them, specifically Clover Minis and Clover Flexes. But that was one technology upgrade. The other was really a shift to move a lot of departments to our online platform using TouchNet so that they could continue to bring in their revenue as expected, just not in person as they once thought.
Thanks for that. The next question, again, I believe this one is for you again, Allison. How many merchant locations do you have at Tufts?
Oof, that number changes more often than I care to admit, but right now we have about 62 merchant locations spread out over 3 campuses.
Okay. The next question is, looks like I'll be fielding this one. Can you clarify the difference between P2PE and E2EE? Absolutely. So P2PE, point-to-point encryption, E2EE, end-to-end encryption. I like to start this one off with, kind of the old mathematic principles about squares and rectangles and how every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. Think of P2PE and E2EE in the same type of light, that all P2PE solutions are end-to-end encrypting solutions, but not all E2EE solutions are P2PE solutions. And so much like how a square is a very special rectangle with equal sides and equal angles and all of that stuff, end-to-end encrypted solutions encrypt from endpoint to endpoint, but P2PE solutions are the ones that are specifically explicitly vetted by P2PE QSAs. They're listed and maintained on the PCI Council's website. Officially speaking, point-to-point encryption, when properly implemented, is the only set of controls that exist that can reduce your scope through the use of a hardware-based solution. Those other ones, like end-to-end encryption, while they do ultimately help reduce an information security burden, they don't officially reduce scope. They may reduce the applicability of certain controls, but you're ineligible to answer the P2PE questionnaire and those types of things unless explicitly given approval or authorization by your bank. The next question in the list, how do you suggest getting IT silo areas to work with our QSA? We have IT not agreeing with what the QSA says and needs, he needs, so we are running in circles. This is a very difficult one for sure, and I think what this really comes down to is making sure that all parties come to the table as open-armed as possible. And I know that in our engagements as we deal with our friends in IT is that there's a very delicate balance between compliance and security, and the QSA has to approach that with the mentality of compliance does not equal security. And in fact, if there are strategies that are being used to make compliance easier, it may be one that adds an additional security burden or reduces a bit of security. And I think the easiest one I can think of is something like segmenting the network to get into an SAQ CVT environment or an SAQC environment or something like that. What you're really doing is you're taking this really well-managed and manicured network that you have visibility to the endpoints and all of these other controls and saying you must cleave that off the network, turn it into a giant black hole that you leave out in the corner, and that's going to be PCI compliant, and your IT folks are going to say, but that takes away all of that, frontline defense and visibility and things that we have. We don't want that solution because it makes us inherently weaker from a security point of view. And really and truly, it comes down to understanding what those concerns are. And I'd say, much like how in the previous slide in the takeaways we talked about communications being key, and not only just for the staff to communicate with the departments and all of that stuff, but for that communication with your QSA to go backwards and forwards with that open line of communication saying, this is why I'm telling you this information. It's not because we're right or it's the only answer, but here's the way we're approaching the problem. And then your IT folks need to then also very openly communicate, this is why we disagree with your solution, Mr. QSA or Mrs. QSA. We feel that this, makes security worse or something of that nature. And it's really that level of honesty that then should come into something that, you get the better answer, right? Both sides work together to the common goal, which is PCI compliance while still maintaining that great security. And with those types of communications in place, you can really get there and do so because you're both headed to the same destination. If you're approaching it with that, arms crossed mentality of I'm right, you're wrong on both sides, you really are going to continue to run circles. So I'd say make sure that communication line stays open and have those great communications. All right, next question. What database software is Tufts using to track the various merchants? If it's Microsoft Access, would you be willing to share?
So right now we're actually using Salesforce. We use Salesforce for some other situations within Treasury, so it made sense to kind of keep that in-house. And I think I see a question also talking about turnover within the departments. So I'm going to kind of combine those answers. Salesforce has allowed us to kind of do a data dump, but then also it tracks inactive information for us, which is where those department contacts, as they change, hopefully someone who may be leaving gives us the heads up of, hey, I'm retiring, I found a position elsewhere, so on and so forth. Your new contact will be, this person, but that doesn't always happen. And so when we start to see lack of communication from one department in particular, that's when I start to look through contacts of that department and say, okay, well, I haven't heard, from Allison in a little while. Maybe I'll try calling Ed just to see what's going on there. Sometimes that gives me some good information. But I would say that having Salesforce and kind of starting fresh with that record keeping, one thing that we really found helpful was while I had a stack of papers that I inherited that was, the equipment inventory, and there was a Word document with the contacts and different forms, right? I kind of ignored all of that. I turned my back to it and I said, okay, what information do I actually need? What will I need to report on and maintain if I were starting completely from fresh? And that's really the perspective we had when we kind of engineered this record keeping in Salesforce. And then we started, once we had kind of a framework, we started taking the pieces of the records that we did have and putting those all into Salesforce.
Okay, I'm going to skip over one of the questions I believe we've already covered with the, what database software you're using. If we didn't answer that to your satisfaction, please put it back in the chat with additional detail. The next one that seems unique here on my end, you've moved the call center to R&L Masters. What about other campus vendors that accept phone payments, conferences, events, athletics, performing arts?
Good question. for the most part, our payment gateways or vendors that we utilize are a good majority e-commerce focused, not necessarily phone payment focused. So that's why it made sense to use Ruffalo Noel Levitt's where we did in the telefund. But we haven't really explored that in any other areas. But that's not to say we couldn't tomorrow.
And I'll chime in with my 2 cents on this one as well. So, being the security advisor and qualified security assessor that's been helping Tufts with their PCI journey, I can tell you that the other areas are using hardware-based, plastic phones that are wholly separate from the computer itself. And I think that was one of the main drivers behind that line that was being drawn. Thinking about the Ruffalo Noel Levitt's campus call and the dialing that happens. If the IP soft phones were in use, that really puts raw unencrypted cardholder data, back on those workstations that are being used to dial out and call. So even if point-to-point encryption were to be put into place, you would still have that audio portion that would bring the computer itself back into scope, kicking and screaming. There are third-party vendors that work with the Campus Call program now that do agent-assisted IVR, so that you get DTMF tone masking and things of that nature. But in 2015, those partners didn't exist, and what that really meant was you would solve one problem but still be left with another in terms of what that does to your scope. Now, I'm not telling you that a plastic phone-based VoIP system is completely out of PCI scope, but even in the securing telephone payments document that the PCI Council releases as guidance, there are certain controls that show up in even in VoIP systems that say, here's the DMARC, this stuff is in, this stuff is out, that's the provider's responsibility. And there are some portions that get treated like a POTS line. And I'd say at present, there's a good number of those merchants at Tufts that it's not a call center environment. It's not an area where 100% of the phone calls are going to contain cardholder data, that it really is finding that needle in a needle stack. There have been decisions that have been made to say, based on this description of the call center, of the VoIP environment, that this looks more out of scope than in scope, and especially due to the fact that there are plastic instruments being used versus IP soft phones. We have seen a variety of areas that, we're still on the analog POTS lines, the old copper plants out at the fringe of campus, that as those copper lines are aging, that our friends in IT have decided to move those over to VoIP, and it was like VoIP plus Jabber client, or now that we're here with the pandemic, seeing more IP soft phones in play, that have certainly brought up issues, and it is the next topic to tackle. If you look at voice over IP and where it fits in your compliance program, if it does operate as a wholly separate environment, that voice and data do not intermingle, and that you have plastic instruments, we're not saying it's not in scope, but we're saying that there's probably bigger fish to fry. And as you get to the point of everything else is in place and done, then you can really start looking at that risk-based equation, how much VoIP comes into scope, where the risk really lies, and then back that up with that protecting telephone payments guidance that the PCI Council put out in 2018. And so that's really kind of the long-winded answer for why Ruffalo Noel Levitt's went first, and the other ones kind of had a stay of execution. But it certainly is on the table for further investigation. But I can tell you that very specific and detailed plans have been put into place to not bring IP soft phones into the picture for that reason, that it would cross that line immediately, and VoIP is the next one up for the big topic there. Okay, so the next question. With the costs of compliance, did you have merchants where it didn't make sense to continue their operations due to their low sales volume? And did you have to have that tough talk that you're not making enough to justify this?
Absolutely. That tough talk came in two different forms. One where we saw folks not, like you described, not making that sales volume really worth it. Depending on how your school may pay the fees related to that merchant account, that was one way we leveraged to show them it may not make sense. Look, you're only bringing in X, but we're spending Y in order to keep you open. So having that conversation is tough. One thing we do kind of offer them on the end of the silver lining is, but we have an e-commerce platform. If you would like to join in there, that has no minimum for us because our e-commerce platform is in one merchant account specifically. So that's kind of you may be too small to have the terminals in your own merchant account, but I'm not going to stop you from bringing in revenue altogether. The other side was when the department would volunteer to give up their merchant account, which I thought was really kind of interesting. Once we put together this PCI program and said, okay, you are a merchant department, you're going to be responsible for XYZ, kind of those roles and responsibilities I mentioned before. Once we put that in a nice condensed list and I circulated that, a few hands went up and said, I don't think we use our merchant account enough to warrant this. So we kind of rerouted them as well. But that's a different conversation where they volunteered to give up their merchant account. But certainly there were tough conversations, and figuring out what that threshold is may look different in every either business or school, but certainly we have had those tough conversations.
All right, one more question here. How have you handled evidence gathering / inspections during remote work? And I can take the first stab at this. I think this is, you know, as my point of view as part of the assessment that we just completed. You know, thankfully this isn't, you know, the early 2000s where remote really wasn't a thing. Through the, you know, platform that we're using today, so that we can all virtually meet and have this conference together, we have this wonderful video conference technology. So I would tell you that, you know, the remote inspection or the remote assessment of the Tufts areas, they weren't nearly as difficult. I always think about, you know, just doing it over the phone and not being able to see body language, not being able to you know, look someone in the eyes and see what's happening. But having the video cameras turned on, having the ability to have the cameras spun around if needed to take a look at an area. The good news for us is that because this was a year-over-year type of visit with Tufts, there were you know, merchants that we've seen since 2015, and that we were part of those changes when they were implemented, and that it was really a check to make sure that things were happening the way that they should, that the policies made sense, and things of that nature. So the good news here is that the remote work went fairly easily, but I do want to caution that with something that sounds like, now, due to Tufts merchant level being 3, that they are self-assessment questionnaire eligible, at the end of the day, it's Tufts signing on the dotted line that they are compliant with the PCI DSS, and it is a self-assessment. There's a portion where, you know, during in that part 3C where it says, you know, did you have a QSA? What was the involvement? That we certainly add our 2 cents. At the end of the day, it wasn't CampusGuard making the full assertion that you were compliant. I do know that the answers change ever so slightly if we talk about remote evidence gathering for assessments, as if CampusGuard were performing a ROC. But thankfully, those questions didn't come up as it was a self-assessment questionnaire, and we were able to provide that assistance and guidance as we had from day one. And Allison, I don't know if you had comments about evidence and samples that you collect, like your tamper inspection logs and things of that nature.
Yes, it's been an interesting challenge, definitely one that we had not prepared for, right? But what we've seen through the site visits, which were done virtually, was inconsistent. Some departments were still doing every part of their routine and procedure to a T. Others had kind of thrown that rule book out and had created a brand new one. And so I think what it came down to was our level of comfort with what was documented, what standard is in place to hold them to it. So we did kind of communicate to all the merchants saying, if you are still accessing your equipment, you are held to the same set frequency of those tamper checking of those devices that you were in January when things were, you know, up and running. Now, for some merchants, they kind of went remote and they do not have access to that office, that terminal or anything like that. And so for them, I'm obviously not expecting them to send me a log of those inspections because they're not taking payment. They're not in the office. That equipment is where it was in March. So kind of a mixed bag, but that is something that we definitely had to create a plan for because we did not have something in place before.
All right. Thanks. And let's see here. I think I have one more on my list. What strategy or methods do you use to manage your self-assessment questionnaires?
Ooh, good question. So each merchant department is responsible for completing their self-assessment questionnaire. We do use the CampusGuard central portal to send those merchant departments to complete the questionnaire. I have some administrative rights which allow me to not only see visibility into those SAQs, but also to pull some really great reporting and things like that. But as far as where and how, we use the CampusGuard central portal.
Excellent. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't put in that shameless plug for CampusGuard Central. I know my marketing manager is going to be watching this later, so I can tell you that it's a brand new offering from CampusGuard. It's the second iteration of our portal. It's got a ton of new features, including those that Allison pointed out, but automated roll-ups and things of that nature. Really fabulous stuff. If you want to see a demo, if you haven't seen the announcements, certainly please let us know. Shameless plug over. Sorry about that. Allison, did any questions show up in your list privately that were not asked as of yet?
No, I think everything has been covered.
Awesome. All right. So, Allison and I would like to thank you again for spending time with us this afternoon. Hope you guys have a great conference. Please be sure to download the PDFs available through the Treasury Institute's PCI Workshop Pathable application. Feel free to reach out to us directly with any questions that you have outside of this presentation. And I'm sorry, but I am going to put in one more shameless plug. Also, please tune in tomorrow for CampusGuard's joint presentation with Bluefin, P2PE plus QSA, securing and devaluing sensitive data through powerful partnerships and advanced solutions, starring yours truly and Eldred Garcia from Bluefin. With that, thank you so much for spending time with us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.